We're going to talk about the war today. Let's do that. Now, I assume that you guys all saw Paths of Glory. So I'm going to talk about the mutinies in a while. And then Jay Winter is going to talk about essentially the Great War in modern memory. And I'm going to end, so make a nice transition to his lecture. I'm going to end with something that he wrote about how reality and art came together in a terrifying way in 1918. Okay, now, comment faire ça? Qu'est-ce qu'on va faire? Okay, so just a few things, at the beginning that are obvious are in the book. But it didn't work out the way Falkenhayn wanted it to. And of course, Schlieffen wanted it to. And the point about the Belgium invasion of Belgium was, of course, that it brought Britain into the war, and the Germans were counting on the fact that it would take Britain a very, very long time to raise an army, not a navy, but an army of any size. And what they called the British Expeditionary Force does arrive and takes its place next to the French, but it's very small, and they don't have conscription until late in the war, because unlike the French, they did not have military conscription. But basically, to make a long story short, is that in part because Germany, as France, as everybody was worried about the home front, basically what happens is they hurt their chances of pulling this off by moving some divisions to Alsace to try to blunt the force there, and also some more are headed off to the Eastern Front, because they start to realize that the Russians are mobilizing more rapidly than they thought they could. And so basically, it's possible to argue that the Battle of the Marne saves Paris and saves France, because and Schlieffen would have gone crazy about this. Remember, the last thing he said supposedly in his life was, "Let the last soldier touch the English Channel and then come down and hit Paris." But they turned down before that, and the first airplanes that are used as reconnaissance planes, the pilots literally had carried pistols with them at the very beginning, and they had not figured out a way to put machine guns on that the bullets wouldn't hit the propeller and then come back and kill the pilot. So all this took some doing. But the first planes were reconnaissance planes, and at one point in this huge engagement featuring just enormous armies, in the German case supplied by trains going many every hour across the Rhine, the French planes see that there's a big a gap in the German lines, and so they counterattack. And the famous story everybody knows. And again, what I want to insist on is, look at where it says Battle of the Marne. There's a town called Lagny there. Now it's practically a suburb of Paris, Lagny. And you could hear, the battle in Paris. You could hear the roll of thunder of the guns. And one thing when you ask how the French home front holds together so long, is that the Germans are so close. And in 1918, they'll be close again. In 1918, they're firing this huge gun, which the British soldiers called Big Bertha, and it's lobbing from way the hell up in the north. It's lobbing shells from the German lines, behind the German lines, all the way to Paris. On Easter Sunday, 1918, hit an apartment house on the Church of Saint-Gervais, an apartment house on the Boulevard Port-Royal, one on the Rue de Rivoli, not too far from our place. And so the Germans are so close. But in 1914, what happens is that, literally the commander of Paris, whose name is Gallieni, and he has a metro stop named after him, as a lot of these guys do. He commandeers the Paris taxis, and they're literally carrying soldiers out to the front at the Battle of the Marne. And what happens is the Battle of the Marne stops the German advance, and then the race to the sea begins. And they try to outflank each other. And again, to borrow a ridiculous football analogy, but it's not so ridiculous. It doesn't matter if you don't follow football. But, if you're trying to get around the outside, you're trying to get around outside before the outside linebacker can get there, and you're trying to turn the corner. And so basically that's what they're trying to do. Both sides are trying to turn the corner, and they end up at the sea. And at that point, the trenches are dug literally from the sea all the way to Switzerland. And so the war, to repeat what I said the other day, only a couple people who had seen what was going on in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, could have imagined that this war in which the offense was supposed to have as in 1870-71, was supposed to have every advantage. Remember, the French commander said, "Élan vital," we need this frenetic, patriotic energy. That's all we need. We need to attack and keep on attacking. It doesn't work out that way. And the reason that you have all of these millions of people killed, the flower of British youth, the flower of every youth in that period, is because this offensive war becomes a defensive struggle in which breaking through is almost literally impossible. Thus, backdrop to what you have seen in Paths of Glory, and that the weapons, the weapons of the war, including really the shelling. Most people are killed by shells in World War I than dying in any other way, and there are new and horrible ways of dying. Flamethrowers, for example. Poison gas, which is first used by the Germans at Ypres, one of the many battles of Ypres. There are 12 battles of the same river in northern Italy. There are several battles of the Somme. I mean, these battles keep on happening because large chunks of real estate are virtually impossible to conquer. And so trenches are defensive weapons. And what makes one of the reasons that the breakthrough is impossible is that when you're going to try to break through these trenches, what they have is what they call creeping barrages, and where they start trying to, and lots of people died with what the Americans call friendly fire. They try to coordinate the shelling so to go in advance of the people going over the top, and then trying to carry 60 pounds, pick up 60 pounds sometimes, worth of stuff on your back, and to down into these horrible craters full of all sorts of crap and dead floating rats and dead floating bodies of human beings, and to try to break through. And then you run into machine guns. And machine guns, which can fire, what is it, 600, something, I just saw this morning or last night, 600 rounds a minute. And the Gatling guns had first been used I think in the American Civil War, but these are much more rapid firing. And they aim basically at your knees, and they just sort of go back and forth. And then barbed wire. One of the things that soldiers had to carry with them are wire cutters, and sometimes the wire cutters weren't equal to the task of cutting the wire. It's hard to cut wire if people are firing machine guns at you as well. And so that's why the trenches, which you'll see some real ones in a minute, are fairly elaborate defensive weapons, and everybody has seen the footage of real battle. I mean, sometimes they've wrecked it, but the Imperial War Museum, which used to be much better than it is now in London, is really worth seeing. And they used to have this amazing small clip of, you see these three guys and they're about ready to go, and one guy blows his whistle, say, "Follow me," and the first guy goes up, and he gets his head over, then he's dead. He falls back, and the second guy goes up, and he gets a little further, then you see his body hit. And then the third guy, when the clip ends, is just about to get out. And you don't know what happens to him, but his chances weren't very good. So breaking through, I mean, there are debates on how ridiculous these people like Nivelle were, or Foch and Joffre and the whole gang, because they keep ordering these attacks. The breakthrough is going to come next. We've really got them. We're going to break through, but they don't break through, and they don't break through, and that again is battles for they can't break through, and that is background for the mutinies. And the first real breakthrough doesn't come until March 1918 in the Ludendorff Offensive, 1918, and then they overrun their supplies, and it kind of snaps back like a rubber band and pushes them back. And the Germans at that point, for reasons I'll explain in a minute, know that they're not going to win the war. They can't win the war. But what happens is going to happen is that when the war ends, and more about this when we talk about the post-war, is that the war ends with German troops far inside France. So how do you explain that back to the home front? And the Berlin home front has started to collapse. There's great deprivation, great problems getting enough to eat in that situation, and that will make it easier later for Hitler and many other little would-be Hitlers to argue that you were winning, but you were stabbed in back by the Jews and the communists and the socialists and the peaceniks and all of these people from their point of view. And so when you do these creeping barrages, you're indicating where the attack's going to come. And the behind the trenches, the Germans, as do the French, have railroad lines that are used to bring in reinforcements, to bring in supplies. And so what you do is you bring in supplies, you bring in reinforcements. And so if you read a great book by Paul Fussell, Fussel, or there are two L's, Fussell, I think, called The Great War in Modern Memory. It's about the war poets. It's about Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen and folks like that. Eisenberg, I quote him in I think one of his poems is in the book. And that is an amazing look at the whole thing. I mean, that's a ready-made paper topic to take a couple of those poems and talk about the war. And so, I mean, breaking through is very, very difficult. It's almost impossible, and that's why you have the carnage. That's why you have, as I said the very first day, if you were here, that there were more British soldiers killed or seriously wounded in the first 3 days of the Battle of the Somme, S-O-M-M-E, like the river, than there were Americans killed in World War I, Korea, and Vietnam. In 3 days. The first 3 days. So you're talking about horrific losses. You're talking about an expectation. I mean, you try to put yourself in the same thing. I think I have that quote in there. Somebody said, you discuss your own death as if you were discussing a lunch that you were planning tomorrow. And someone else said, I didn't want to die at least until I'd finished reading The Return of the Native. And so that, again, is background for the mutinies. And what is amazing is that, and again, the French situation, because of the precariousness, it's difficult to explain how people could have continued to fight in many ways. And again, looking at the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where they had huge losses, is that the armies hold together really until 1917, and even beyond the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the Russian case, too, is remarkable. The Battle of Tannenberg is just an amazing battle in 1914, and the Russian there's so many casualties they couldn't even count them. There's so many people dead, and there'd never been a war like this. No one had ever seen, couldn't have imagined a war like this. And the proximity also. I mean, the English had the advantage of having the Channel there, but it's one of these. If you've been to Victoria Station, I mean, it's one of these things they always say about the war, but it's true. Is that you go to the Officers Club in Victoria Station, have a decent lunch, knock down a couple pints of beer, and you're on the front in the early evening and can be dead by early evening. And it is said that in Kent, these miners, these Welsh miners in Belgium, they tunneled under this sort of promontory that's sticking up, that's a defensive position for the Germans, and they bring in all these munitions and they blow the thing up. They blow this huge thing up, and in Kent, supposedly, it is said that people in Kent, on and near the coast of the English Channel could actually hear the explosion. So the war is that close, and of course it's close in other ways. Is that every day? Imagine that you lived in a village, and in France or anywhere, and the facteur, in our case the factrice, the mail carrier comes, and what you don't want to see is you don't want the mail carrier to come to your house. You don't want mail, because he would be carrying a telegram saying, be proud of X, who has just died for, you fill in the country, Turkey, Bulgaria, Romania, France, Germany, Russia, Britain, anywhere. So it became a war like no other war, and with the only possible exception is the Spanish Civil War, has given birth to really the greatest writing about arguably any war, certainly in history, and arguably any events outside of maybe the rise of Hitler in National Socialism in Germany, because it was like that, and it really couldn't have been any other way. And they're still trying to they're still arguing over these battles. Passchendaele, we once drove up. Passchendaele was one of these places that they first used poison gas, and now it's a lot of lotissement, a lot of in Belgium, a lot of housing developments, and I just wanted to go and see there. And you can't even see there where the hell that was Passchendaele was actually there. if you're going to go see these battlefields, the one to go to is Verdun, which I'll talk about in a minute, because there you can go through these forts, Douaumont and Vaux, and you can imagine what it's like, and you can see some places where they've left in the winds and the mists and the terrible weather of that part of France, and the one road going from Bar-le-Duc, supplying on the sacred road, supplying Verdun. You still see there's one place where they've left the guns with their bayonets, and there's a lot of hand-to-hand fighting there, and that's the place where Falkenhayn said, we can afford to lose more children, more young people, more young men. We will simply outbleed them. And he hurdles one attack after another over most of 1916 against Verdun, and that's where so many people die. And of course, that is the background also for these mutinies. Okay. I don't always do that. Okay, here we've got, here's the Western Front, 1915, 1917, and you can see that it really doesn't, it doesn't move at all. But again, I mean, look, there is Paris, and there is fighting. And by the way, these places like Reims, R-E-I-M-S, is a beautiful cathedral which was rebuilt thanks to the Americans after the war. The Carnegie family gave a lot of money, and ordinary people rebuilt the cathedral. It's one of the great cathedrals anywhere in Europe. Reims was right on the line. And of course, Reims just got pounded. The whole place was just totally devastated. Arras, there's another example up there, right on the line. And I can't remember on the first day or not if I didn't relate a story of people that we knew about 8 years ago who were actually killed because of World War I. They were killed. As a family we knew who were cousins from of really good friends of ours, and would come down there, and there was a boy the age of my daughter then, and I guess he was 12 then, and we met them, and we had a good time talking to them. And then I asked how they were at Thanksgiving. When I went over to Thanksgiving, not that in France we don't celebrate Thanksgiving, but I had 10 days, so why not? And they were dead. Not the father, but the son and the mother had been killed by World War I, because their house was right in Arras, and in the basement they had a fire. This was just you were 10 years old when this happened. This was World War I, still killing. And they were killed because there was a fire in their basement, and they didn't know that on the other side of the wall were all these munitions stocked right near the front on World War I, and the fire caught and it blew up the house. And the father wasn't there, and this little guy, and his mother were blown up, killed by World War I. In 1920s, there were people killed all the time. You still, every couple weeks, you still see in the paper now that they found bomb in Berlin from World War II, from all the bombing, or in Dresden and all these other places. In World War I, there were constantly, farmers were blown up as they were plowing, constantly, as they were plowing on these battlefields. Around the Chemin des Dames, for example, which is up near, you can see the Somme there. That's a good one to have there. But the Chemin des Dames is up near there. It's north of Soissons. Anyway, and if you go to any of those départements, if you go up, any of them, if you go to the Marne, which is where the Somme basically was, or in the Pas-de-Calais, which is Picardy there, you can see they're just fields and fields, these cemeteries with hundreds of thousands of crosses. And one can go on and on about this, but there's never been anything like it. And so war became the dominant experience in the lives of Europeans, period, no matter how old you were, because you knew somebody who died. You had a relative who died, period. There are in France, where much of the fighting was, the Western Front fighting was there, and in Belgium, there are 36,000 communes, which is an administrative unit. 36,000. 12 out of 36,000 had nobody killed in World War I. And there are places you can go, particularly if you're in the south of France, where you can go where they didn't have any reason. They were all taken. If people were skilled workers who could work in munitions factories, could get out. And there are a lot of tensions between rural and urban people, because there was urban people who had rationing problems, said, oh, you know, the rural people are hoarding their products and stuff like that. But there are places you can go where you see these, and I'm a counter. I count things all the time. It's maddening. You'll find there's one town, there's 74 people died, very small town in the south of France, in a place called Aveyron. And you know, there's hardly 74 houses. And there's a village that's quite beautiful. It's a 12th century church, way up in the Cevennes Mountains, about where we take tourists, you know, and there's when you walk there, the monument to the dead is inside the church. And when you show people this beautiful Renaissance entryway, porte, and there's 12 people killed in the war. And you cannot count, there aren't 12 houses. You can't count 12 houses. People don't live there anymore. Hardly anyone's there. So, I mean, we know more about the Western Front. Now there's some good books appearing on the Eastern Front, but it's the same thing in every country that you're talking about. But as the list of people, percentages, or the numbers of people killed around will make clear what the countries were that really suffered the most, and they were they were Germany and France, and then followed by Russia, but also Britain. And don't forget, in Britain, you remember I said that the four empires disappear. Well, the fifth empire arguably disappears in the end because of dynamics caused by the war. Because after people in the so-called colonies, fighting for the British Empire, they began to think, well, why shouldn't we have independence? Why shouldn't we have freedom too? And of course, at the Battle of Gallipoli, which is one of the great tragedies of the war, when Churchill, who had 10 ideas a day and 9 of them were bad, as one of his critics said, Churchill said, well, why don't we'll take the pressure off we'll knock the Turks out of the war. And so they're going to have this impossible assault on Turkish fortified positions. And so they said, well, we'll knock them out of the war with the Australians and the Indians and the New Zealanders. And, we can afford to lose them more easily. They're not really ours. And of course, that still resonates in places like New Zealand and Australia and in India as well. It should. But anyway, that's another complicated story. And we have other stuff to do. So read things on this. It is a phenomenal thing. The mutinies. Just a little bit to the mutinies. The Somme, you can read about them and all of that. When I used to work at Vincennes in the military archives there, because I was writing about 1830 and 1848 and all that stuff, I was reading day by day, the correspondence from various regions in France, and I was trying to find these documents that I knew were there. This was when I was just starting out. I wasn't much older than you guys, and I'd like to think that. And younger than I once was, but anyway. Here, whatever the song is, and I knew this stuff was there, and the person that ran it was out having a sort of a torrid affair with this guy all the time, and so she was never there at lunch, and she didn't know what she was doing anyway. And so I bribed one of the guards to let me back in the stacks where you're not supposed to go in French archives. But the guy was a stamp collector, so I kept leaving all these jazzy, and I knew that. I left all these jazzy stamps on my table, and finally he said, "Oh, those are beautiful stamps. Oh, would you like them?" And the next thing I knew, I'm in the back. But I remember what I saw was this huge thing of boxes. This is in the mid-'70s. This huge number of boxes that were chained up, literally. They were in this cage, and they were chained up. And, I mean, really chained up, with big locks and all that stuff, big security. And I said, well, what's all that? And he said, well, those are the mutiny documents. Those are the documents from the mutinies in 1917. Now, finally, a guy was able to get in, because in France there's a 50-year rule, and he should have been able, 50 years after the fact, he should be able to consult documents. And this guy was finally able to get dérogation, as they call it, to get exception to go work on these documents. And so the thesis that was published is very good by a guy called Guy Pedrocini, whom I don't know, and it's on the mutinies. So now we know about the mutinies. So what do we know about the mutinies that confirms what you saw in the film? Several things is that the mutinies were spread rapidly. They did indeed begin with soldiers who were being sent to the front baaing like sheep, as if they were being sent to a slaughterhouse, because that's what they were being sent to. What's the difference between a soldier carrying 60 pounds of equipment going to some attack that's going to go nowhere, whereas chances of being killed are enormous, and sheep being led to a slaughterhouse? What is the difference? Really not much. except you're dealing with a human being and not a sheep. And so that was a bad sign for these officers. And when the mutiny started, there were only really 4 reliable divisions, they figured at one point, between Paris and the German lines. The incredible thing is because soldiers never talk about the battle when they go back. They don't talk about the battle. It was impossible to communicate what was going on. And the mutinies were one of the well-kept secrets. Nobody knew. The Germans didn't know at the time. Hardly anybody knew. Nobody is probably too strong. But the mutinies involved thousands and thousands and thousands of soldiers. In some cases, they elected people to represent them. In a few cases where the officers maintained the upper hand, they simply summarily shot mutiners. Mutiners. Well, yeah, mutiners. Do you say mutiners? I don't know. People who mutiny. I confuse these things. So, they were massive. But they had nothing to do with socialist or anarchist or pacifist propaganda at all. There were attempts. There were congresses. There was a congress in Sweden. There was another one in Switzerland. The French government would not let representatives go to those congresses. And the first reaction was, in the high command was that, well, the socialists and now they're showing their true stripes. Anarchist propaganda is working. Look at the Bolshevik Revolution. It had not yet happened. That was in October, but the Russian Revolution in February had already occurred. It has nothing to do with it. What they objected to, they were not defeatist at all. They did not want the Germans to win the war. But they realized that they weren't going to win the war either, and that this strategy was completely futile. There were cases of fraternization. They're very famous cases. Christmas, 1914, on the front, way up near Belgium. On the British side particularly. They start yelling back and forth, the Germans and the British, and they say basically, screw this stuff. Why don't we take the day off? And so the Welsh were singing Christmas carols to the Germans, and the Germans were getting their best singers and singing back. They actually did get together and play a soccer game. They found a place that wasn't totally chopped up and played. In 1915, on Christmas, a British soldier said, why don't we do the same thing? And they put him up against the wall and shot him. There were these rumors that were very persistent during the whole fighting in the Western Front that underneath Reims, where, after all these Champagne caves, or underneath Albert, that was the town where the statue of the Virgin Mary on the top of a church hung like this. And the Germans said, if it falls one way, we're going to win. If it falls the other way, the French are going to win. That somewhere, the people who were lucky enough to be alive were down there, and they would come out and take food, and they would take wine rations and stuff like that. They would take them back from the dead, and they were all partying underground, and that they were the lucky ones, and they were all fraternizing. It wasn't that case, but still, you hear all these stories, and the great war poets are saying, well, yeah, so and so, these two German guy and a British guy find themselves in a crater, both on the verge of death, and they're discussing Nietzsche until somebody finally comes and rescues them. I mean, a lot of this may be apocryphal, but the mutinies had to do not with defeatism; it had to do with the sheer madness of it all. And it was mad. And there's still historians who are saying, well, the creeping barrages, if they hadn't made them, they'd made them a little bit more organized, and maybe the breakthroughs would have come. And they're still defending the impossible after all of these years. And so, God. Okay. Something happened. I want to show you these. Please. Am I turning it? I think I'm turning it off. Simon, can you? God, I am null. It was very dark at the Battle of Verdun. What happened? Can you do this? Yeah. Okay, these are real ones from Verdun. Verdun was 1916. It begins in February. It rains all the time in that part of France. And this will get, to explain the mutinies is also to understand Verdun. This is reconnaissance plain. Those are craters there. Those are craters. Those are some more craters over there. Next. And that's Fort Douaumont or Vaux. And when you go to them, and you really should go to them, I mean, it's a long way from Verdun. Verdun is the town that's near there. But the one I'll never forget is when you go in and you see these, after the war, like as people do in churches, people would come and put plaques. And the most moving one is, "To my son, since his eyes closed, might have not ceased to cry." Next one, please. And so that's, you'd be going in there. And those are where the plaques are, right there. This guy, right there. They're plaques. In fact, that plaque that I just said is right next to that there. Now, you're here, and they say, "Over the top, men," and you're trying to get on the other side there. How are you going to do that? That's all barbed wire around there. How are you going to do that? You can't. These are just, that's inside Vaux or Douaumont. Night patrol. Again, there's a trench. And they're attacking. But you've got to climb over your own barbed wire too. Because that's barbed wire that's protecting you from if they attack. And the casualty rates are just absolutely phenomenal, at all these. The casualty rates here are not the same as the Somme, because it wasn't a massive attack. You're defending it against the Germans, and they're taking care of some people that are getting hurt. I mean, they would have been hurt. Carrying somebody back. I mean, the poor guy looks a little peaked there. Telephones. The Russian phone system was so bad the Germans could hear every single word that they said on the Eastern Front. Next, please. Well, you get the point. There's the machine guns aimed low. Medical. That's fantastic to walk in there. But you have to remember that, a lot of the fighting is on the outside, and the mists and the snow and the crap. It's just, it's an amazing thing. But they held. They held. And Marshal Pétain became the hero, a hero of France. He would have later incarnation in World War II. We'll get back to him. But they hold. How are you going to run up that hill carrying 60 pounds? There's a commune, by the way, called Douaumont, which is the only commune out of the 36,000 that no longer exists because it was so battered that there's a difference in height in these hills of 50 and 100 feet, and it could never be rebuilt. Next, please. Yeah, we get the scene. And it is amazing how little people knew. What they knew in the home front, and there's a very good book edited by Jay Winter and his friend Jean-Louis Robert about capital cities at war, about London, Paris, and Berlin, comparing the home front. And it's really good stuff, as to how little people knew about this. It's like an Italian said, do people really imagine that we just jump up and down screaming, "Long live Italy"? It's one of the most amazing things is that people in the hell actually more of them didn't mutiny. That's one of the most incredible things about the whole bloody mess. Now, they died in hell. They called it Passchendaele. That was a place where the British gained 4 miles. That's about 7 kilometers in exchange for 300,000 dead or wounded. 300,000. Take a football stadium like University of Michigan or UT Austin and fill it up 3 times and imagine that you know those people. That's what it was like. 1917. 1917 changes everything. 1917 changes everything because 2 key events happen, and they're obvious. One is the Russian Revolution in 1917 in February. That's A. And then B, and this is still point number 1, is the Russian Revolution in in October. And it's clear that we'll talk about this, or you can read about this. The Kerensky provisional government is under tremendous pressure from the Allies to stay in the war. But it's clear that when the Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917, that the Russians are going to get out of the war. And that peace, land, and bread is a powerful, powerful slogan for the Russian soldiers. And it's amazing that the Russian soldiers didn't all go back to Vladivostok or to Kazakhstan or to wherever, that they were able to hold on as long as they did. And so that's going to change things. It's at that time that the second event happens, and that's the Americans come into the war. Now, the Americans, outside of places like Chicago and Milwaukee and Philadelphia, maybe, they had lots of Germans. Most people in the United States, the tendency was to want the Allies to win, to live to fight another day, and the Americans were angered by the submarine warfare campaign. In 1915, a boat called the Lusitania was sunk. There had been warnings posted by the German government saying if you're a passenger, don't go on that, you're going to go in a war zone. The Germans claimed when the boat was sunk that it was full of munitions. The Americans and the British said no, it wasn't. In fact, it was, and that was proved about 20 years ago by divers. It sunk near Ireland, and lots of people died. And the Germans know that the only way they can win the war is the unrestricted campaign of submarine warfare to try to keep Britain from being supplied by American supplies. And Wilson, who won election, Woodrow Wilson, Princeton, who won election he kept us out of war. He takes the country into war, and eventually he can't get the Treaty of Versailles passed even by the American isolationist Senate. And so the Americans go to war in 1917. I took Yale alumni, besides taking the Épernay to drink champagne, a lot of them wanted to go to, this is a long time ago, to Chateau Thierry, which is the first place that American soldiers fought in 1917. But now, it wasn't the American troops that made the difference. I mean, in the imaginaire, in the perceptions of the French, it was the arrival of General Pershing, who had made his career sort of slaughtering Mexicans in Mexico. The image was that the far west was coming, and these sort of gun-toting Dodge City types were going to turn the tide. That's not what happens. But what turns the tide is that once the Americans are in the war, that the tremendous industrial strength of the U.S. Means the curves are going to cross. And by that simply I mean the curves that the Germans know they ain't going to win the war, and the British and the French and the American high command, they know they're going to win the war, and they think they're going to win the war in 1920 or 1921, maybe 1919 if all goes well. There was a quote in there after they just had, at the cost of thousands of lives, I think it's still in there, they had got a couple kilometers of territory back from the Germans, and somebody says, at this rate, we'll get to the Rhine in the year 2006, I think is what they figured. And the longue durée, of being in for till the end was going to be a long time if you were able to survive. So those are the two big events. The curves cross. 1917 is also an important year because tanks begin to make a difference. Tanks can't do anything in these craters. They get stuck. What are those things? They're treads. Just sort of spin like a car stuck in the snow in North Haven or something. They don't make any difference until they can break into the open, and at that point, then they can be a way of protecting infantry behind them. But so 1917 really turns it around. And to make a long story short, yet again, in 1918, Ludendorff, by this time, Hindenburg and Ludendorff basically have taken over the government. Basically, the Second Reich is now controlled by the military. And of course, Hindenburg has a rather pernicious role in the long run to play because he was determined to destroy the Weimar Republic, even though he was president. And as he in 1932 says, we'll bring in Adolf. We'll bring him in as chancellor. But anyway, so Ludendorff said, look, we've got to do it now. If we don't do it now, it ain't never going to happen. And so they throw every conceivable resource into this offensive, and they do break through. They do break through. And you can look at the maps in the book. They get a long way. But then it snaps back like a rubber band. They overrun their supplies, as they had in 1914 in the big war offensive. In 1914, they begin to overrun their supplies. They get tired, and then they're pushed back. And at that point, the worst days of the bombardment of Paris is ended. The Allies are sure they're going to win the war, and that the Germans and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is almost on the verge of collapse, despite the sheer inefficiency of the Italian military, they know that it's going to collapse, and that Russia's coming out of the war in the long run did not make that much of a difference, because the Italians are able to stabilize really the front in Austria-Hungary, and the whole thing is going to collapse. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the nationalities are putting forward their claims, and Franz Josef dies in 1916, and it's not going to go that long. And finally, on the 11th of November 1918, in a railroad car in Compiègne, near Compiègne, in the forest, very far north of Paris, they sign on the dotted line, and the armistice is declared. In 1940, Hitler would accept France's surrender. It wasn't actually the same railroad car, but they told him it was. Also in the forest in Compiègne, near Compiègne, in 1940, and the war ended. Now, more about this later, but basically, France in victory is not as strong as Germany in defeat, because Germany is industrially a much more prosperous country, and this will hang over the negotiations at Versailles, because the French demand that somebody pay for the war, of which France suffered more than any other country in terms of its agricultural land being chewed up, the finest land in France, et cetera, et cetera. So that's going to hang over the peace proceedings. But I want to make just a few comments before I end with Jay Winter, and we have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to do that. The highest percentage of losses was France, with 16.8% of those mobilized killed, and Germany 15.4% killed. But if you take those actually in combat, it's 22% officers and 18% soldiers. Because remember, officers, they weren't all fancy generals who were sitting drinking champagne, plotting the deaths of all these people. The junior officers, and not particularly, but also the case in a British sense, the flower British youth from Oxford, Cambridge, et cetera, they're the ones that blew the whistles and said, "Follow me, men," and they'd jump over armed with only a pistol. They're toast. They get killed even in greater percentages. Anyway, Serbia loses 37% of all its combatants. They don't have as many. Turkey 27%, Romania 25%, and Bulgaria 22%. Now think of this. The war starts in early August 1914 and ends on the 11th of November 1918. Every day of those years, every day, think 4 years back in your own lives, and then every day, 900 Frenchmen were killed every day. Every day. That's a lot of telegrams. Be proud of X. 1,300 Germans were killed every day. The death rate was higher in World War II. Of course, in World War II, the Soviet Union has an unbelievable death rate. 25 million people die. Some of them in Stalin's Gulag, but most of them because of the war. The death rate was higher. July 1st, 1916, just the first day of the Battle of the Somme, 20,000 British soldiers were killed. Not just killed and wounded, dead in one day. So they were there to go over the top, and they're dead at the end. Unlike previous wars, disease didn't play a major part, unlike, for example, the Crimean War. Though the blue flu, sometimes called the Spanish flu, as you know, will kill more people in 1918, 1919, 1920 than the war. That's the big pandemic. As I said, most people die of shells, followed by machine guns and flames, despite progress in medicine. Now, also, things like shell shock were first identified at this time, after the war. Freud was very interested in that, among other people. So the psychological, I wasn't just when you went to the Paris Metro or the London Tube and you saw people begging with one arm, or one leg, or no legs. Is that you saw people who had also choked out their lungs on gas, who were blind. They were all over the place. And Europe was a country of widows, especially in countries like Italy where widows still wore black all the time. Europe was a country of widows. If you had a demographic curve, a triangle, it was like a shark had eaten a huge bite out of the male population between 18 and, say, 55. No one had ever seen, the length was simply staggering. The Battle of the Somme lasted 5 months. Gallipoli lasted more than 8 months. Verdun, 10 months. Ypres in 1917, 4 months. On the Battle of the Somme, you talk about how war influenced people's lives. 4 million men participated in the Battle of the Somme. 4 million. That's a phenomenal statistic. More than a quarter were killed, captured, or portés disparus, or were classified as disappeared. Disappeared. Nothing left. Battlefields were no longer called the field of glory. That went. The language went. I make an allusion to that, which is an obvious one at the end of what you read. Also, there's a brutalization of the sense of humanity that you lost because you were dealing with so many people dead all around. You were fighting for your life. The attitude that people had toward other people changes, and the demons of the 20th century, fascism, above all, would be built on that dehumanization. Difficult to imagine, though not impossible, the Holocaust without World War I. But given the Turks and what they did to the Armenians, it's hard to say. Also, atrocities. There were atrocities. Now there are a couple good books on atrocities. Most of the atrocities were committed by the Germans in Belgium. They executed 5,500 Belgian civilians. Edith Cavell was the most famous, the nurse, in part because German soldiers believed that they were being picked off by civilians, is what had happened in France in 1870 to 71. But the Russians committed atrocities in East Prussia and in Galicia. The Austrians, who had been told that the Serbs were subhuman, committed atrocities there. There were rapes, not yet. Rape had not become an arm of combat, as it would with the Russians after World War II, but people were treated like animals. Hitler said in 1939, after all, who will remember the Armenians? That's an incredible, chilling thing. So I want to end simply with Jay, with Jay Winter, whom you're going to meet soon, assuming I can find this. And it's about a haunting film done by Abel Gance. It's called J'accuse, I Accuse. It's not the same thing as Zola's I Accuse, but it's another one. Made in 1918 to 1919. The hero, Jean Diaz, is a wounded soldier poet. He begins to lose his mind. He escapes from the hospital and he reaches his village. There he summons the villagers and he tells them of a dream. It starts in a battlefield graveyard with wooden crosses all here and there and everywhere. A huge black cloud rises above it, and magically ghost-like figures emerge from the ground. They're wrapped in tattered bandages, some limping, some blind, walking with upraised arms, stumbling blindly like Frankenstein's monster. They leave the battlefield and they go home. They go from the graves to their villages. And they want to see if their sacrifices have been in vain. And they get back to their villages, and what they find is that their wives have cheated on them. They find that the people are still ripping people off by false weights at the market. The petty ways have continued despite the horrific losses. And they say, you must mend your ways. We didn't go through all of this hell so you would continue to behave like you do. The world, after all, must be a better place. Isn't it a better place now? Won't it be? That's the big illusion, by the way, about 1920s and 1930s, because the world wasn't going to be a better place. It wasn't at all. And they believe their mission is fulfilled, and they go back to their graves. After recounting this dream, the poet, now totally mad, accuses the sun above of standing idly by and watching the war go on. And then he dies. Now, one of the oddest thing about this, about how art and reality merge, is that this film was made before the end of the war. And Abel Gance, the producer, got permission from the army to have real soldiers be extras in his movie. And you can see real people who are not going back to the front with their arms ripped off. Stumps. They had stumps. And some of the people who were in that movie went back to the front and were killed. And they didn't survive the war. The war had taken a terrible vengeance, both in art, joys of great artistic production, but on reality too. It's an incredible scene. And of course, things couldn't be back again. You couldn't go back to your village. You couldn't get off a bus at the end of the and go back and fall into the arms of your family and stand there with tears in your cheeks as you're counting off the names of the dead people that you knew. Things are going to get better, but they don't. And one way of looking at the entire period, 1914 to 1945, and Jay will talk about this, is to view it as an entire, more horrible 30 Years' War. Because things don't get better, they get worse, if that's even possible. On that light note, I wish you a happy election.